From the heart of the Midwest, where heritage meets the glass, you're tuned in to a deep dive with the man behind the Badger Beer Report. He's taking you behind the tap handle and into the brew house to talk shop with the legends of the craft. This is The Session with Greg Washington.
Good afternoon and welcome to The Session on the Badger Beer Report Network. We are streaming live across YouTube, Facebook, and the Wisconsin Beer Barons X feed, y'all. If you've been watching the headlines this week, you already know that a massive 177 old pillar of American industry history is officially drawn to a close. Pabst has announced that they are permanently sunsetting Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, y'all. It's a brand that survived everything from the Great Chicago Fire to Prohibition, once standing as the largest, most dominant beer brand on the face of the planet. Before that chapter closes forever, though, the brewing industry is giving this legacy a dignified farewell. This Saturday at 12:30 p.m., right here near me in Verona, Wisconsin, a definitive final 80-barrel batch will be mashed in. And to ensure it goes out to the absolute respect it deserves, they are turning to clock using a composite recipe meticulously pulled from the 1948 brewhouse operations logbooks. The man steering the kettles for this historic final drop joins me right now. He is a legendary Wisconsin craftsman, a master of the trade, the brewmaster at Wisconsin Brewing Company currently. Welcome to The Session, Kirby Nelson. Kirby Nelson, thank you for joining us.
All right, Greg. And I have to take umbrage to that legend descriptor. I'm just a guy who's been around a long time and has a big mouth. That's how it goes.
All right. I know there's a few people out there that may agree with that assessment, so maybe we can have a conversation over some Schlitz here in a couple weeks. But Kirby, Pabst owns the brand, but Wisconsin Brewing is executing this definitive final batch. Walk us through the business arrangement and the logistics that led to Wisconsin Brewing Company being chosen to brew that final chapter of a 177-year Milwaukee legend.
Well, I love you use the word just to intro the program, the heritage. I'm so much into the heritage of the state of Wisconsin in terms of the brewing industry. I am from Wisconsin. I grew up South Milwaukee, hearing about all the great old brands such as Schlitz and Blatz and all that. So, yeah, I'm very hardcore brewer, very hardcore, proud Wisconsin brewer. And we have a very strong, working relationship with Pabst, who owns a Schlitz label. And I'd heard from their distributor down in Glunz, a gentleman named Jerry Glunz, whose family has been distributing Schlitz since the early 1900s. They made Schlitz huge in Chicago. In fact, Schlitz used to ship beer bulk down to them, and they would bottle it for them down in Chicago. And so he's been a big supporter of Schlitz all his life, and he'd been told that they were winding down production, that the demand was no longer there that could justify the product, and which is unfortunate and seems to have happened to a lot of great beers in the last few years. So, we've worked a lot with Pabst. We've helped develop some of their beers. We produced some of their products, and we just, I wanted the beer to go with a bit of shot of respect and dignity. It's not that, they were dissing a brand. It was just a natural, again, evolution of a business, but they agreed immediately. We asked them, we'd like to do a Schlitz brew, and they said, please do. They're a great partner to work with. And so away we went. Now, I'm very fortunate in having a friend named John Lupowitz, and John is a hardcore Schlitz collector. It's amazing the stuff he has in his collection. And he went up, literally when Schlitz was ripping everything out of the offices and throwing them away, he went up there and was buying stuff. And one of the things he purchased was 5 brewhouse records / logs books that dated from 1912 to 1948. And I'm sitting back looking at, thinking about this Schlitz thing. And, there was a time, 1950, Schlitz was on top of the brewing world in the United States. were selling 5 million barrels a year. Anheuser-Busch was second, and they were popular as can be and became known as a beer that made Milwaukee famous. Well, so what I decided to do, these records went to 1948, and even though they weren't specific formulas, recipes, step-by-step instructions per se, they gave me ideas of how much barley versus corn grits they were using. This is an adjunct brew. We're going to be doing a cereal mash. I ain't going to cheat by using flake corn. And I basically formulated this beer to be 75% 6-row malted barley, not 2-row, because 6-row is the workhorse in the American brewing industry in the 20th century. And looking at the original, gravity was higher than it is today. It was at about, I think I'm targeting 12.7. It should be a 5 ABV. It won't ferment out quite as far, hopefully. So it'll have a little bit more body and mouthfeel. So that was what Schlitz was at the peak. It was a little bit stronger, or I should say beerier, than the mass market beers of today are. And so it had all this more beery richness that a person like me loves. And it was still eminently drinkable. And I'm also going to choose a bittering. That was trickier. They really didn't have any specifications on bittering or alpha acids of hops. They were earlier in the century. They had, let's say, 50 pounds domestic hops, 250 pounds imported hops in a 425 barrel brew. What I did was decide to choose a bittering of 18. I think Schlitz prior to Prohibition would have been in the 30s, but it was easing off over time. Beer during this time period that we're talking about, the 50s, give or take, one of their logos, one of their sayings was just a kiss of the hops. American beers by this time were turning into lighter, more pleasant, easy to drink products. I once heard a definition of mass marketing being what you do is offend the least number of people possible. And American beers, always being very high quality, by the way, just became a little more mild, for a polite term, as time went on. But in the mid-50s, it still was a bit of a gutsier beer. I used the ratio of 1 part domestic hops to 5 part imported per what they were doing prior to Prohibition. And of course, the German hops, it didn't really say anything, but in the back of one of the pages, I saw scrawled in German something with the word Hallertau. All right, Hallertau Mittelfruit. And Yakima Cluster was the workhorse of the American brewing industry in the 20th century. So it's a blend of Cluster and Hallertau hops to give us a bittering of about 18. I'm really looking forward to this. Also kind of terrified, but hey, we'll see. I can't hear you, Greg. Hello, Greg.
You shouldn't be tired. You shouldn't be terrified. I had my mic on mute. So just so I didn't interrupt you, but you shouldn't be terrified. I think you're going to execute this well, and I'm looking forward to the final product. But while we're here at ingredients, let's stay here for a minute. So we talked about the hops. Are you spinning a proprietary heritage lager yeast strain? And what are we doing with the malt too? Because it's hops, malt, and I'm not going to tell you that.
Right. Well, the yeast strain, we really don't know what they're using. We use a strain of lager yeast from Omega. I believe it's a Bayern strain at the moment, which we've been using for a number of years, and it makes a real solid lager beer. And the malt, I'm glad you say it, is kind of critical. And we are using 6-row as opposed to 2-row. All right. Understand the history of American brewing. As we headed west as a nation and we were still making beers with all malt, the beer was terrible. It was very, very harsh, unpleasant. It turned out we had a lot of husk as opposed to endosperm. So what were we going to do? Well, brewers had realized by that time that the enzymes naturally present in malted barley can catalyze the breakdown of starch above and beyond what's in the barley corn they're contained in. And so they learned you could take materials such as corn grits, rice, and have them undergo their own cereal mash to make the starch granules inside here explode, and the starch would be assimilable to attack, so to speak, from the malt enzymes and add it together. So you would get a beer of the strength you're looking for, but the adjunct would cut the harshness of the malted barley back then and make for a much more pleasant, palatable product. I believe the use of adjuncts such as rice, white corn grits prior to Prohibition, and yellow grits today are the hallmark of what I would call an American standard lager. And the one thing about 6-row malt, it's got a little bit higher enzymic power. A lot of folks said, well, 6-row is not as good as 2-row because not as much endosperm, a little more husk can make for a little bit harsher beer. I say bullshit. At Capital, I used a blend of 50% 2-row and 6-row forever. In fact, early on in craft stages, I thought the 2-row malt available to brewers then was made for a relatively bland beer. I preferred 6-row, but it has fallen out of favor. It's hard to get, but in order to be a proper mid-20th century beer, we're going to use 6-row malt.
Excellent. And so you want to talk about how many barrels? Well, I said it at the top, but was there a factor in this limiting how much we brewed?
Well, again, people have been calling this the last Schlitz, because the brand at this point in time is, let's say, on hiatus, so to speak, from the brewery. I'm hoping it's not the last Schlitz. You know what I mean? I hope the brand does eventually come back and stay with us and evolve. Mm-hmm. And I totally lost track of my thoughts, and I've been doing that today. So
I asked you about how much, how many barrels.
The reason we chose 80 barrels is that's the size of our. And what's going to be interesting in the brewing process, again, we're going to use a cereal mash, but we don't have a cereal cooker. So what we do is what I call a hybridized cereal cooker upper infusion mash. We basically will have a small amount or a much smaller amount of water than needed for the whole brew in the mash tun. And then we'll add a little malt charge, and then we're going to add corn grits. And these undergo their own upward infusion that ends up in boiling. And the boiling faction, what that eventually does is explode the starch granules and make all the starch I mentioned earlier assimilable to the malt enzymes. And that has, that's going to be boiling. So then at the end of boil, we have to add cold water to get us close to our strike temperature, then add the main malt on top of that, and away we go.
Excellent. And so a historic final drop requires a matching aesthetic. What are the packaging logistics for this final run? Are we talking limited edition, heritage edition, 12-ounce can?
Well, we're basically
what are we doing?
Well, basically, we're designing that right now. And if you look at the label from the Schlitz in the 50s, is basically the same, pretty much the same as it was today. It's got that beautiful angular Schlitz look and the beer that made Milwaukee famous underneath the verbiage of Schlitz. And that's what we're going to be doing based on that. And what also is cool about this particular brew is, you ever heard of Old World, Wisconsin?
Yes.
Right. It's a great place. And they have a little brewery based on what it was like to brew in the mid-1800s, all right? Mm-hmm. It's the 7-gallon system. And I went and did a porter there last summer, and it was a lot of fun, very cool setup. And the beer actually turned out pretty nice. Well, Rob, the brewmaster, Rob Novak, got a hold of me and says, hey, it's our upcoming 50th anniversary. This summer, we're going to have a big celebration at Old World, Wisconsin on July 4th. You want to do a collaboration brew? And I said, you know what? I think I got something already in the works. And so this beer is just going to be available at our brewery on June 27th. And I tell you what, we're getting a lot of response on. We haven't even started pre-selling yet, and people are demanding. And then also at Old World, Wisconsin, and our July 4th 50th bash.
All right. And now that Kirby mentioned that, we were going to put up our QR code, y'all, where you can go to get the information, or that is where the pre-order will start on 5/23, which is Saturday, right, Kirby?
Yeah, we're going to be brewing this Saturday. And even though we can't let a whole lot of people back here, unfortunately, I will be doing a brief chit-chat on a little bit of history of Schlitz and what this beer is all about that we're doing. And during the lottery, during the first wort, I'm going to bring out some pictures of first wort for folks to taste to see what it's like before it becomes beer. So yeah, we want as many people here as possible to take part of the brew, but the big blowout's going to be Saturday, June 27th. I'm looking forward to it.
Saturday, June 27th. Absolutely.
Right.
And while we're here, what is the path for managing a single site, high volume release that is bound to pull in thousands of nostalgia customers from all the Midwest? It's going to be, y'all throw some big parties out there too.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like we ain't to get, it's not like
we've had up to 3,000 some people here. Yep. So we'll see. I'm going to be hiding in the control room. I won't be out there trying to help folks off, so to speak. But yeah, no, we will deal with that. We want people to come out and have a great time and taste the heritage of the state. Because again, that to me, that's why this beer is important. Heritage, history. What Wisconsin beer is all about. Milwaukee became known as such a brewing center with breweries like Gettleman, Blatz, Miller, Pabst, and of course Schlitz. And Schlitz in the mid part of the 20th century was on the top of the heap and setting standards for the world to follow.
Yeah, and this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask next, which is, as a master brewer who's watched many shifts in this industry for decades, what does the Pabst strategic decision to permanently, or maybe almost indefinitely, sunset a historic anchor like Schlitz tell you about the viability of legacy regional brands in
It's
today's
very
economic
difficult.
climate?
It is very much a challenge. Everyone loves to talk about history and heritage, but not everyone walks that talk. And a beer like Schlitz it's just the image of what it once wasn't there anymore, from my standard opinion. There's a lot of people that are still drinking it. And if you go on some of the Facebook pages regarding Schlitz, they're very upset about this. But I've seen it happen with brands such as, Falstaff, for example, disappeared that way. You could go on and on. Look at the hit Anheuser-Busch has taken compared to in the early 90s, when the Anheuser-Busch product was 1 out of every 2 beers drank in this country. They have struggled also. The industry is very challenging right now, as anyone who's in the bureau realize, and it's tough. With people drinking less alcohol, brands are very vulnerable to being discontinued. And what's depressing for me is, you talk about the craft end of things. I'm on a lot of auction sites, and I bet you in the last 2 weeks I've seen 8 to 10 breweries going up for auction, small breweries, and it's very depressing. But it's just that it grew so fast, so quickly, and a lot of these beers became fads, I believe, and I think that's dangerous, because fad seems to be a short-time thing. And so craft just exploded from 2010 up until peaking, I believe, in 23, 24, and now the so-called shakeout's happening. Volume is down for a lot of breweries, all breweries, and a lot of breweries aren't making the cut, and unfortunately, a lot of equipment's available in the market. So it's kind of the natural ebb and tide flow of the industry, I guess.
Yeah. And let's double back here, though. Given how deeply personal this brand is to you and the production capabilities you have in Verona, was there ever a conversation about y'all buying the Schlitz thing and keeping it going? Or
you don't know how much
you had to ask.
I can't tell you, Greg. I can't tell you how much I'd personally love that to happen. But again, this is Pabst brand, and from their standpoint, yes, it is being discontinued right now, but it's also never say never. Again, we're talking about a brand. The reason I think Schlitz has caught the imagination is the history behind it and how well known it was. And so I don't really think folks want to see it go away, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, that's not enough. So on a personal note, you were laying to rest a 177 old pillar of Milwaukee history when you stand at the Kettles on Saturday at 12:30 to mash in that final batch. What does that moment mean to you as a Wisconsin brewer?
It means a lot. I mean, it is, quite frankly, I'm honored that Pabst is allowing us to do this. And this beer represents a great time in just not Wisconsin, but American history, post World War II, where we're really starting to feel our oats as a nation. So it's a responsibility, and I take it very seriously. I do want this beer to represent Wisconsin and our brewing heritage the best that it can. And so, yeah, it is an honor. It is exciting. And of course, since I'm a bit of a worrywart and Alzheimer's concerned about this step and that step, and when we add the corn into the mash tuns, it can be too much of a drag and too high amps on our mixing motor, things like that. All this technical stuff that I really shouldn't be worried about, but I am, because I feel so strongly I have to make this beer right.
Well, good luck to you on that. Now, I have one final question for you, and then we'll wrap up and get you out of here, because I know you're brewing today. Not the Schlitz, but he's brewing. I mean, they crank out down at Lake Louis, y'all. They cranking them out there. But I have one question from our director of brewery relations and outreach, Joel Geyer. He wants to know, or we want to know here in the BBR newsroom. So the Wisconsin Brewing Company holds a massive naming rights to our brewing company park, home of Lake County Duck Hounds. The sub-brand Lake Louis recently pulled its dedicated presence out of that stadium. Talk to us about the strategic business behind that move and what drove your decision to pull back to Lake Louis in this way.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, it just didn't work out in a business standpoint as it should have for us to continue it. It's a wonderful little brewery. I love brewing on it. It made great beer. It was very brewer friendly. Easiest spent grain removal for a brew pub system ever, believe me. But unfortunately, from what we required out of that little brewery, it just wasn't happening, and so we had to make a decision. So what we did is, yes, we did shut down the Dock House Brewery, and we are no longer the name sponsor of the stadium. But I'm looking right to the right, where is a mill from 1970 that we used to mill our grain for the brewing right now. In fact, it was a gift to me from Mark Stutroot at Summit Brewing out of Minneapolis. And that is going to be removed, a smaller mill put in, and our 5-barrel system will be about 15 feet from where I am. So we get to continue to do a lot of cool, fun stuff.
So Kirby gets to play. Still.
Yeah.
All right, Kirby.
Right?
Well, yeah, right. Well, thank you for pulling back the curtain on a monumental week here in Verona and in the entire history of Wisconsin brewing. Any other details you would like to get out here? I will wrap up. When I wrap up, I will make sure everybody knows the details for sure about the logistics, about what's happening with this. But anything else you would like to say before you get out of here and go back to brewing?
Well, we covered it very well. We asked very good questions. I hope I answered them articulately and so people could understand it. But no, man, I just say, Wisconsin is the best. It is the brewing state in the United States, and I'll fight anyone who argues with that. We've got such history, such heritage, and we've got a lot of great brewers dedicated right now to keeping those heritages going very strong in our state. So it's a great time to be a beer drinker. What can I tell you?
It is. And thank you, Kirby, for doing this. Thank you for your work and what you've done and the inspiration that you've caused, especially here in Madison. I could speak for that, but of course across all of Wisconsin. Thank you, Kirby Nelson.
All right, y'all enjoy.
Have a good one. All right. So y'all, so now transitioning from the news on the ground to historical impact, our editor at large, Chris Drosner, recorded today's edition of The Perspective, a new segment here that we're going to do. Last evening, we met and we did this. He's going to take a deep dive into recent history of Pabst, what's likely brought them to the sunset of the Schlitz brand. Full disclosure, our live audience tuning in on YouTube, Facebook, and X. About 8 minutes into Chris's editorial here, we hit a major technical difficulties behind the scenes that cut the audio feed. So, but even with that edit, Chris goes through the tracking and the exact timeline of this final brew. So let's go to the tape of Chris delivering the first perspective here on the session.
I'm Chris Drosner, executive editor of Milwaukee Magazine and editor at large with the BBR crew. Welcome to the very first edition of The Perspective. You can't tell the history of industrial brewing without talking about the giants that built Milwaukee. But history does not stop corporate streamlining. In this editorial, we're looking at the end of an era as Schlitz, the grand Milwaukee brand, is phased out, and why the death of one classic brand might actually change everything for how Pabst operates in the modern market. Here's my take on what this shakeup really means. And we're going to start at the beginning, not 1849 when the brewery was founded or 1855 when the Schlitz brand actually began, but 1999 when Schlitz, its years of being the #1 beer in the world, its years of being debased by its corporate ownership and becoming a laughingstock in the beer world, was bought by Pabst Brewing Company. These are two obviously titans of Milwaukee brewing back in the day that by 1999 had pretty much been on the rocks. All the Milwaukee breweries had closed. The beer world was changing, and it was not changing in the favor of these kind of very, very old school brands. These are the days of Miller Lite, Bud Light, before Coors Light even really eclipsed Miller Lite as a thing. But Pabst had an interesting idea, and that is acquiring all these kind of nostalgia laden brands, very much like Schlitz was, when it died. And what that looks like today is a Pabst Brewing Company that, of course, has PBR as its flagship, but also Old Milwaukee, Old Style, Olympia, Blatz, R.I.P. Blatz bottles, or yeah, National Bohemian, Stroh's, Lone Star, Schmitz, Stag Primo. These are brands that mean a lot in certain places and don't mean a whole lot, or might just carry curiosity in a lot of other places. These are not, with the exception of PBR today, national brands anymore. And Pabst really built its strategy on this. This is what Pabst is. I mean, certainly the Blue Ribbon is the flagship, but it's hard to say what percent that is in terms of the larger overall company, right? Without being inside it. And to be honest, we have not asked Pabst for any factual, confirmation of any of this stuff. But if you're in markets where these beers are popular, you know what space they occupy, and that's kind of like the $3-4 tall boy, they're kind of dive bar beers. And what this tells me is that, what this, meaning the Schlitz discontinuation, tells me is that is not a going concern right now. Schlitz was the decision to kill Schlitz instead of like maybe bring its footprint back into the Midwest or shrink it somehow and let Milwaukee continue to have Schlitz while, Tucson doesn't need Schlitz and they have something else. That tells me that something major is happening in the beer world. And we've seen this, beer has been declining for several years, as overall, like, the bigger trend is that alcohol consumption is down. Young people, who I imagine are probably more into $3 tall boys than, maybe middle-aged folks or older folks, that's the younger people are not drinking beer as much. So when you've got, when you've got a portfolio of like 40 of these brands, that's trouble. And this is kind of what happens. We saw, the move that was reported first in this was that they were cutting back on packages, and a handful of like really weak brands like Old Milwaukee Light or Blatz Light, stuff like that has a really, really small market. But for a flagship like Schlitz to be culled at this point, tells me that this is that they need to consolidate, and they need to direct their marketing dollars around fewer brands. And when I think about the marketplace of Schlitz tall boys or Schlitz generally in Milwaukee, I think about like Hamm's and High Life are probably two of the bigger competitors. PBR certainly, but like Hamm's and High Life are two brands that I see a lot more than I did in bars, either on draft or tall boys bottles, whatever, than I did even just 3, 4, 5 years ago. And these are occupying the exact same market tier and niche as Schlitz. So putting aside the pain that this causes me as a Milwaukeean who's interested in the city's history and Wisconsin, I mean, Schlitz transcends Milwaukee, certainly. Wisconsin takes pride in all its brands, and that's really evident in the reaction to this news, which is a lot of hand wringing and hair pulling. And but I also think that, like, well, I'm gonna miss Schlitz, but when was the last time I had a Schlitz? And it has been a long time. When was the last time I had a High Life? Literally today. When was the last time I had a Hamm's? Recently, more recently than a Schlitz, for sure. So not to make this like too Chris's preferences centric, but there's a gap here in between what Pabst's strategy has been with all these really regionally very strong brands like National Bohemian, huge in Baltimore, Lone Star, big in Texas, Old Style, big in Chicago, Olympia, big in the Northwest, Rainier, all of these things have really regional cachets that I think Schlitz kind of lost in Milwaukee because we kind of perceived it as a national brand, even though there's the Schlitz Audubon Center here, and the beer baron names are pretty much everywhere in Milwaukee except for Blatz, I guess. This doesn't really roll off the tongue, but I guess the point being, the heritage of this brand, ultimately it's still just a brand to Pabst, and you can't really fault them for that. To their credit, they did not, they're saying that this is on hiatus and it's not gone. And I think that's evident in the situation that you see with Kirby, who you just heard from, and Wisconsin Brewing. That my guess is that I should. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So yeah, Pabst acknowledges that. Tacitly acknowledges that Schlitz still has value, because this is not an announcement of a sale of the brand; it is an announcement of a hiatus of the Schlitz brand. So, and I haven't I haven't asked Kirby about this, but maybe Wisconsin Brewing asked to buy the brand and they said no, but we can brew a single batch of it. So where this leaves Pabst going forward, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm going to be watching their strategy going forward a little bit, and I think it'll be interesting to see. In the meantime, I'll be thinking about Schlitz. I was at Solomons today for a happy hour, and I noticed all the Schlitz memorabilia on the wall, and I took a picture of it, and I kind of got a little bit of the sad. So, it's losing things that we celebrate with is always a challenge. We see this when breweries close. When we spend times that people develop emotional connections to brand, to beverages, to brands, to breweries, and that happens when a brewery is around for 2 years. But when it's around for 160, I don't have my notes, I didn't do the math. 160, it's a long time. More than 100, like generations. That's a different story, and it hits a little bit different, and that's what's happening right now. I'm lighting a candle for all these other brands in the Pabst portfolio. It would be insane for them to shut them all down. But notice has been given for sure. All right, that's enough for me. This is Badger Beer Report. I'm Chris Drosner. This is The Perspective. Peace.
All right, y'all. All right. Before we close, I want to give you some critical points on the Schlitz release. If you want to secure a piece of this 177 brewing history, pay close attention to Lake Louie and Wisconsin Brewing, their social media for sure. Their Facebook has everything. If you go to this QR code up here, it'll take you right to the website that will have the pre-orders live this Saturday. And as Kirby said, Saturday, June 27th is the big, release, big party. And yeah, there'll be the online pre-orders are going to be for the 16-ounce 4-packs of this historic 1984 recipe that Kirby crafted. This Saturday he's doing the mash-in at 12:30 at Wisconsin Brewing, and then Saturday the 27th the beer will be released. So that wraps it up for this edition of the session. Huge thank you to Master Brewer Kirby Nelson for joining us today, and to Chris Drosner, Wisconsin Beer Baron, for bringing the perspective. From the entire team at the Badger Beer Report, I'm Greg Washington. Keep your glasses full, support your local tap rooms, and we'll see you back here soon. We're probably going to have a session next week. I am this close to finalizing it. One of the Actually, the tease will be it's one of the big four. It's someone from one of the big four breweries in Wisconsin. So y'all mess around with that. We will see y'all hopefully next week, but if not, soon enough. And I hope that you enjoyed this edition of the session with me, Greg Washington. Cheers.